Thank you very much. Thank you. Welcome, our Father Mitch Packwell, and welcome to Threshold of Hope, where we take a look at the writings of the church. Before we get to Pope St. John Paul, I want to mention that today is the feast of St. John the 23rd. He was elected Pope he was born in 1881, but elected Pope in 1958, and he died in June of 1963. He is important for a number of reasons. He worked in the papal diplomatic corps for many decades. And in doing that, he became instrumental with Pope Pius XII in saving many Jews from the Third Reich of Germany. They would do baptisms of convenience. Actually, they would just print out baptism certificates and hand them out to Jews so they could escape. And then they also would give papal, the equivalent of visas from the Vatican so that escaping Jews could then get into Turkey or into Palestine, which was under the mandate of the British before the war and during. He also helped ships get out of Italy because Pius XII was very instrumental in getting many Jews onto ships that went to Turkey, and from Istanbul they could escape for their lives. So St. John the 23rd was very instrumental in doing that. He also had worked in Bulgaria and Greece, so he had a very good sense of ecumenical relations. He dealt with the Orthodox clergy and, of course, with Jewish clergy, and Jewish rabbis. So he then announced in January of 1959 that there was going to be a council. And I remember when that was announced, and this was something that was very important for us as Catholics. Lots of changes came about. Sometimes people think that he was the architect of some of the problems that came from the spirit of Vatican II. As I was telling the audience beforehand, his first encyclical was on mandating the teaching of Latin as a spoken language. And he did reform the liturgy, the Tridentine liturgy, a little bit in 1962, made a few little changes in it. But, a lot of things that people attribute to him were not really what he did. It was the way people interpreted him. But he's was Man of the Year for Time magazine. He did a lot to promote peace. He met with the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople in an early move toward this work of reunion with the Eastern churches, for whom he had great respect. So these were very important moves, as well as he offered to mediate between President John F. Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev of Russia during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which had brought the world very, very close to nuclear war. It was very close. So today is his feast day because it commemorates the opening of the Vatican Council. And that's why they chose this date. All right, we are continuing on with Pope St. John Paul, who, by the way, in part took his name from St. John the 23rd. And we're dealing with his encyclical Veritatis Splendor, the Splendor of Truth. You can get a paperback copy from EWTN's religious catalog. You can buy it either by going to our website, EWTNRC.com, or you can call 1-800-854-6888. 6316 if you're in North America. You can also download a free electronic copy of Veritatis Splendor from our document library at our website. The main website is EWTN.com. You'll see a faith tab at the top. Click that, and you'll see document library. Click that. Type in Veritatis Splendor, and you can download that into your computer, read from the computer, or print it out from anywhere in the world. Also, we would love to have you get involved and participate in our show. You can come to Birmingham, actually Irondale, Alabama, which is beautiful today. The weather's just gorgeous. And you can do like these nice folks, mostly from the Cincinnati metropolitan area, have done, plus folks scattered from other places. Or you can send a question by email to threshold@ewtn.com. Or you can call during our live broadcast, which is on Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. If you're in North America, the number to call for a live question is 1-800-221-9460. Or if you're outside North America or inside Birmingham area, you can call 205-271-2980. All right. We are continuing this section that began on paragraph 98, which is entitled Morality and the Renewal of Social and Political Life. There's a need. We're beginning with paragraph 100 today. He mentions that the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which he had just promulgated not too long before this encyclical, affirms that, quote, from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 2407, where it says, in economic matters, respect for human dignity requires the practice of the virtue of temperance, so as to moderate attachment to this world's goods, the practice of the virtue of justice, to preserve our neighbor's rights and render him what is their due, and the practice of solidarity, in accordance with the golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself, and with the generosity of the Lord, who, though he was rich, yet for your sake became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. Quote from 2 Corinthians 8, verse 9. And by the way, golden rule, of course, I made a mistake there. It's golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So the Catechism brings out these three virtues for business. Temperance. The people who own and run business need to have the cardinal virtue of temperance. This means that you don't try to get everything you possibly can and use it for yourself. Indulging yourself in every whim that you have is the opposite of temperance. It's not, self-indulgence is the opposite of temperance. Temperance is learning to maintain a certain amount of self-control over the use of material world. And this is very important so that you realize the things around you don't control you. You can give up or you can use things, but you don't have to use them. That's extremely important. And the St. Ignatius of Loyola would add that you should seek to use the things of this world insofar as they give glory to God, and you refrain from using them insofar as they don't give glory to God. That's where we set the norm. Even when it's legitimate, it's your possession. You may own money, but do you need to live lavishly Do you need it? Is that lavish life going to give greater glory to God? Ought to be a question. And that's something very important. The second cardinal virtue he mentions is justice, which recognizes that other people have rights, and I have an obligation to live out my rights and respect theirs and honor their rights. This is very much in conflict today. And this is a question that we need very much to ask, especially as we see Mrs. Clinton and others who are very willing to say, you must change your religion to fit my immorality about abortion. Now, she doesn't say my immorality. She says that abortion rights are something that we need to change religions to accept. Now, that's not respecting other people's rights, and that our religious right is in the Constitution. Right to abortion is not. It's not there. And so these are the kinds of things that all of us have to have. And then solidarity. Solidarity means that we have this concern, especially for those who are poor. What can we do that's going to be truly helping them? Now, this is where there's room for lots of disagreement and discussion as to the best ways to help the poor. You know, I think honestly that in our country, all the political parties want to help the poor, but they strongly disagree on the best way to do it. That's fine, so long as their goal is not just to undo each other, but really seek what is going to be best for the poor, to get out of their poverty. And, you know, this is where the government, you know, has made lots of mistakes in regard to the poor. For instance, having housing for the poor is a good thing. However, if poor people get a job, then the government raises their rent. So that becomes a disincentive to get a job because the amount of money you keep is the same. Now that doesn't help. So they need to think this without allowing for fraud. See, they're afraid of fraud. And so that's, you know, and it's good to discourage fraud, but you also have to encourage the folks and to be able to get out of public housing into their own private property and to be able to determine their own economic future better. And when they now they've been destroying all these big housing projects that were made in the 50s and 60s because they were a catastrophe. But one of the reasons they were a catastrophe is there was no place where small business people could start a business and begin to make their own contribution to the economy in any legal way. If they did, then they could be kicked out of their housing. This was crazy. Again, well-intentioned, but not helpful to the poor. So again, we want to help the poor, but use as much sense as helping them become not poor, to become independent, and to be able to determine their own economic life for their own good, and not for the good of politicians on one side or another. That's not the goal. So that's where the solidarity with the poor comes in. The Catechism presents a series of kinds of behavior and actions that are contrary to human dignity, because that's what we want to promote. Human dignity in business and in care of the poor. So, for instance, theft is against human dignity. And retention of goods that were lent, I mean deliberately retaining goods that were lent or objects that are lost. If you find a wallet with money in it, you don't keep it. You try to find a legitimate owner, if at all possible. And if you do have an address in there, you don't keep the money that was in it. You also don't have fraud in business. That's why in Deuteronomy 25, verse 13 and following, you see it stated, you shall not have in your bag two kinds of weights, a large and a small. And you shall not have in your house two kinds of measures, a large and a small. A full and a just measure shall you have, so that you do honest business. This is something that's very important, very important. Also, you have to avoid forcing prices by trading on people's ignorance. Sometimes people don't know that they might lose money in a deal, and that's something that has to be dealt with. Or other kinds of hardships. So these are the things that you have to work to make sure that they have no hardships due to your business. We're going to take a little bit of a break. We'll be back in just a minute, so please stay with us. So, a little technical issue, but we'll keep on moving along here. Also, I want to mention that it is equally wrong for people in business to pay unjust wages for the work. So that certainly is one of the issues between the payment of men and women. That when women do the same work as men, or men do the same work as women, they need to be paid equally. That's why in Deuteronomy 24, verses 14 and 15, it says, you shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brethren or one of the sojourners who are in your land within your towns. You shall give him his hire on the day he earns it, before the sun goes down, for he is poor and sets his heart upon it, lest he cry out against you to the Lord, and it be sin in you. We also want to avoid the misappropriation and private use of corporate property of an enterprise. So if the company has a car, you can't say, well, they're not using it this weekend, I'll just take it home and I'll drive around on company gas. No, you can't do that. That's not yours. You have to be honest toward the employer as well. And other issues is doing your work badly. Workers who don't care about their work that's a form of theft. You have to do your job well to help the corporation so that you'd earn what the money you get. And also tax fraud, forgery of checks and invoices, excessive expenses, waste on oneself. All of these are very important things to avoid. Again, the Catechism of the Catholic Church in 2408 and following says, the seventh commandment forbids theft, that is, usurping another's property against the reasonable will of the owner. Promises must be kept, contracts strictly observed to the extent that the commitments made in them are morally just. These are requirements according to the seventh commandment. And we also see in the Catechism 24:14 that the seventh commandment forbids acts or enterprises that for any reason, selfish reasons or ideological reasons or commercial reasons or totalitarian reasons, lead to the enslavement of human beings, to their being bought, sold, and exchanged like merchandise, in disregard for their personal dignity. It is a sin against the dignity of persons and their fundamental rights, to reduce them by violence to their productive value or to a source of profit. That's why St. Paul directed a Christian master to treat his Christian slave no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother, both in the flesh and in the Lord. And when he had opportunity, he asked masters to release their slaves. And as the church gained its influence throughout Roman society, saints like John Chrysostom and many others worked to tell Christians, you have no right to make a slave out of somebody for whom Christ died to set them free from sin. And the first country to absolutely condemn and remove all slavery was England, at the behest of the bishops, not the kings. And then, as we discussed earlier this year, after Easter, actually after I had my heart attack, we had already prepared this, but it was popes like Eugene IV in 1436, within 5 months of the beginning of the African slave trade by Europeans. Pope Eugene IV condemned the slave trade under automatic excommunication with no possibility of forgiveness until you set the slaves free and return their property. And that was repeated at least a couple times every century. In case people forgot, that was on the books. But today, what we see is that even though slavery is illegal, it exists. And there are more slaves today than there were in the 17 and 1800s. The difference is, instead of working in the cotton fields, they work in between cotton sheets in the sex slave industry. So many people who are coming across our border illegally are brought here by slavers. They require them to work in the sex trade until they pay back this unstated amount of money for an unstated length of time to bring them here to America, where they're still at risk of being sent back because they're not here legally. And so these are great, great crimes. Now, in paragraph 101, he then goes on to talk about politicians and politics. In the political sphere, it must be noted, pay up close attention here, it must be noted that truthfulness in the relations between those governing and those governed must be established. They owe us telling the truth. Openness in public administration. You don't make secret deals with big banks and other big businesses and other countries contrary to the will of the people, the knowledge of the people. We want impartiality in the service of the body politic. Whether somebody votes for you or not, they have the same rights. Whether they're of different races or religions, they have the same rights as all citizens in our country, guaranteed by our Constitution. But this should also be part of the natural law. There should be respect for the rights of political adversaries. And again, we've seen many countries where if you lose an election, you get arrested just for losing. And it probably would have happened that the other one would have been put in jail for that same reason. Safeguarding the rights of the accused against summary trials and convictions. That's what dominated Russia in the communist days. These show trials. The Nazis did the same thing. And on the other hand, if somebody who is on your side commits a crime, they can't get away with it either. Smashing up IRS computers And all of that information about withholding the rights of political opponents was wrong, morally. And it's not, and it would be wrong, it was just as wrong in the recent IRS smashing of computers as it was when Richard Nixon did it. That was wrong. And it's something that belongs to either party, as we apparently can see. We also have to seek the just and honest use of public funds. That happens on the federal level, especially through bribery. And some politicians find stacks of money in the freezer of their refrigerator. And we also see it happening even more commonly locally. Ask the people of Illinois, what happened to the $100 billion from, I think it's 100 billion or 100 million, I forget which, in the state retirement fund that the legislature spent, and they've been arguing over who should pay it back. In Illinois, they have a wing for the governors at Joliet State Prison. They ought to expand it to include the legislators. Just, maybe it's not, they didn't do anything illegal. The rejection of equivocal or illicit means in order to gain, preserve, or increase power at any cost. So that politicians want power because I can't stand anybody else to have it. I want it. That is wrong. All these are principles primarily rooted in and in fact derive their singular urgency from the transcendent value of each person, not from your political affiliation. And it's shameful to think, well, I'll support this party to get anything I can. That would be sinful. Because if you justify the wrongs done by your party, because they're worse than the other guy, you're making a terrible mistake. The sins and evils done by one party are bad, as are those of the other party. And neither one can be justified. That we also have to follow the objective demands of functioning of states. In Pope St. John Paul's exhortation, Christi Fidelis Laici, paragraph 42, it says, the spirit of service is a fundamental element in the exercise of political power. This spirit of service, together with the necessary competence and efficiency, can make virtuous or above criticism the activity of persons in public life, which is justly demanded by the people. That's why I don't like calling them our rulers. They should be the servants of the state and servants of the people, and not pay that lip service. Today, when we see that when these principles are not observed, the very basis of political coexistence is weakened. Is that not Congress? Nothing gets done? Because the parties are so wanting to do their own thing. And the life of society is gradually jeopardized, threatened, and doomed to decay. This is something that we see, is it not? And, folks, the economy is failing, or is moving slowly, more slowly than it needs to, because the government is overly involved. That's why Psalm 14, verse 3-4 says, they have all gone astray, they are all alike corrupt. There is none that does good, no, not one. That's why the basket of deplorables is not among the people who vote. Shameful. It's, from what I've just seen in the recent debate, it's in the people who are running for this office, who are dealing with their own horrendous sins in public ways, that it shows how important the commandments of God are in one's private life when one comes into the civil life. Today, many countries have seen the fall of ideologies of totalitarian conceptions of the world, especially Marxism. Marxism, atheistic Marxism, was the most dangerous form of government in the history of the world. Nothing came close to it. Not the Mongols in their invasion in the 13th century comes close. I mean, Joseph Stalin executed more of his own people than Genghis Khan and the other Mongol leaders did in a whole century. And Mao Zedong did about almost twice as many killings as the Mongols. This was an evil time. And even though these have fallen, there is still grave danger that the fundamental rights of the human person will be denied. Look at Russia today. Sure, communism is gone, but oligarchies have taken their place. People didn't learn morality under the communists. And as a result, it's filled with corruption and religious yearnings, that arise from the heart of every human being can be absorbed into the politics. Politicians who use religion say, you have religious freedom or freedom of worship, as now the present administration, the Obama administration, is putting into the questionnaire that when you're taking the test to be a citizen, they're using the phrase freedom of worship. That's not in our Constitution. That was in the Constitution of the Soviet Union. Our Constitution guarantees freedom of worship, or freedom of religion in all aspects, not for this administration. And we also have to see that there's a risk of an alliance between democracy and ethical relativism. Notice how when on one side, when so many in the press said of the sexual escapades at the White House in the 90s, oh, that's just personal stuff. It has nothing to do with anything in government. And then they say, oh, this guy's talking this nasty way, and he shouldn't be president. Can't let that in the White House. They're relativistic. The reality is, any attacks on the integrity and dignity of women, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, is inherently wrong, because it's wrong to attack dignity. And people in power who use their power in office or out through money or through political influence in order to rape or seduce women or men are committing grave sins, and none of that is justifiable. And using relativism in that way removes any sure moral reference point from political and social life. And we can't tolerate it on any side, any more than we can tolerate lying to the American people under oath. We see clearly Mrs. Clinton has done that. She didn't have a bad intention, they said, but she lied to us. She lied to the Congress. When you lie to Congress, you lie to us. And we see the other politicians lying as well. None of it is justifiable. It's an attack on the dignity of our nationhood and on our rights as citizens to have people we can trust in high office and low office alike. That's why we have to be very careful on the local level and at the level of the primaries to try to get moral people in there. Indeed, as it says in his Pope's encyclical Centesimus Annus, paragraph 46, if there is no ultimate truth to guide and direct political activity, then ideas and convictions can easily be manipulated for reasons of power. As history demonstrates, A democracy without values easily turns into open or thinly disguised totalitarianism. Never forget that. When we're being lied to and deceived, when politicians are saying one thing to us in public at their speeches, but then behind closed doors they're telling rich business people and bankers something the opposite, they are attacking our dignity. And all of this is something that we have to deal with in all spheres of our society. All right, we'll take a break. We'll come back in just a couple minutes with your comments and questions, as well as those from our studio audience and emails. So please stay with us. All right, let's go right to calls. I had to cover a lot of this material, so let's go over to James. James, where are you from?
Erie, Pennsylvania.
Great. And what's your question?
Traditionally, there's 5 non-negotiable issues in any election, and there's even, I think there's some new ones now. The 5 are abortion, euthanasia, stem cell research, which kills the human embryo, human cloning, and then standing up for the true nature of marriage, one man, one woman. Now, I'm going to add a couple more. Religious liberty, don't forget the Little Sisters of the Poor, and then physician prescribed and assisted suicide. But it seems, we should be emphasizing very clear the presidential candidates, Democrat, Republican, and their party platforms, which, party stands for which. And, in my opinion, Democrats are promoting these evils, and Republicans are trying to promote life, liberty, pursuit of virtue, God's law, and the natural moral law. Just please comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the things that you're right. These are questions about human existence, whether somebody lives or not. There are lots of other important moral, political issues. But if you're dead, none of them apply to you. So killing somebody removes all the other issues. And I would say a couple things. In terms of all of us, whether you are committed to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, or whether you are a libertarian or some other party, or you are independent, we need, again, way before November, the first Tuesday in November, we need to work on influencing the politicians to make their issues reflect our values. We need to try to have an impact so that they do respect life, and that we can then have discussions for trusting that people will survive. Then we can have discussions. What do you do to best help the schools, the immigrants, legal and illegal? What do you do to help refugees? And why we can deal with all of those issues, and we must approach them. But we have to start off with life, and I would urge people of both parties, because just because one party is more in favor of using death as a solution to the world's problems than is the other party, and that's why I put it, aborting and euthanizing people, because as Nancy Pelosi had said, think of all the money we'll save. Remember that? In the health care bill, we've got to have abortion and birth control. Think of the money we'll save. No, it's not about saving money, it's saving lives. Let's work on that so that then we can move forward on the other issues with good, serious discussions. and rational analyses of what's going on to actually get the help done and not win or lose political points by politicians. You know, their career is not as important to me as is the life of the poor and the unborn and the sick. So those are things you have to keep in mind. We have a question from our studio audience. Ma'am, where are you from?
Kentucky.
Great, good to have you. And your question?
Don't our rights come from God and not from government?
That is absolutely the clear statement of the Declaration of Independence. And the one force who has been most challenging of that over the centuries is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in Dred Scott decision said that black people are not of the same caliber, they're not equal to white people because of the way they're born. They are inherently inferior. That's in the Dred Scott decision. And defending, remember that? Lincoln said, no, we got to go with the Declaration of Independence. And Douglas of the Democratic Party had said, no, the Supreme Court has decided, and this is what we have to stay with. That's wrong reasoning. The reasoning has to be on the higher principle. Same thing with Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate but equal. It meant blacks had unequal access in reality. And Jim Crow laws were pushed. You know, look at Woodrow Wilson pushing some of the nastiest ones on the federal level, but local levels. And then Roe v. Wade. These are attack on, so the Supreme Court attacks that right, and they don't have the authority. It says in the Declaration that these are inalienable rights granted by the Creator of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the court has no right to take it away. We have Jeff on the line. Hello, Jeff.
Hi, Father Mitch.
Hey, where are you calling from?
Virginia.
Great. And your question?
I don't like either candidate. That's
Neither do I.
I was wondering, is it a sin not to vote?
Here's the thing. I would vote. Yeah. Keep in mind that this is a basic principle of morality. When you have a right, you also have a responsibility. And neglecting your responsibility to vote. Now, do you have to vote for one of the two from the main parties? No, you do not. But you also have to keep in mind there are other people running locally. You know, in some races, it's governors, senators. Certainly, it's always going to be representatives to the U.S. Congress. All of them are up every 2 years. And then you have judges, etc. And you have a moral obligation to be as knowledgeable as you can of those candidates and get to vote for ones who are competent and ethically good. Again, it's better to do it earlier on than the election itself. But you have to do that. Now, if you want to vote for somebody else, for president, you may. I know the Bishop of Lincoln, Nebraska said vote for another alternative if you can't stand either one. But, you know, you also have to keep in mind that whoever ends up winning by refraining from voting for president, you help that person win. All right, and it's always going to be a refraining from voting is always a vote for the winner of the election. All right, whoever it may be, and it's been certainly an up and down cycle, to be sure. I have another question from our studio audience. Sir, where are you from?
Cincinnati.
Great, good to have you here. And your question?
I have a comment question.
Yeah.
I struggle with how any Catholic could justify voting for an openly pro-abortion political candidate.
Yeah, so do I. Here's one of the things that in general, people will say, yeah, well, I'm not voting for that. I'm voting because I want this, or this. There are other issues at stake. I'm concerned that this one is going to be better for the environment, though. Read the recent dump of emails that's being put out there, where Mrs. Clinton privately is just as in favor of fracking as is Mr. Trump. So there's no difference there. So you have to pay attention to that. But also, you have to pay, the people say, well, what about issues that affect the poor and racial justice, and you have to take a look beyond the rhetoric that comes in the media so that you know what they actually, say, and what the facts are of each one's. And again, one of the problems is with both sides, lots of secrets keep coming out through emails. That's why I always say, God forgives everything. The internet forgives nothing. Nothing. And so, we'll see throughout the rest of this election cycle, we'll see lots more coming out from both sides. But it's going to be something that we have to pay close attention to. And then we still must ask the question we talked about earlier. What is there about the other issues that makes it trump life? Why is it more important to have these other issues than is the right to life for innocent people, whether in the womb or in their deathbed? It better be something really big. And I can't think of anything for myself or for anybody else. So that's something to keep in mind. We have Ted on the line. Hello, Ted.
Hi.
Hi, where are you from?
Hammond, Indiana. It's Father Ted.
Oh, Father Ted.
Yeah.
Oh, great. I didn't catch that. That wasn't on the list. Great. I have a lot of relatives from over in Hammond, and a lot of them are from Hegewisch.
Yeah, I met you a long time ago at a conference at Wheaton College, and so.
That was a long time ago.
Yeah.
That's about 25 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. The question that I had has to do with, I wonder if you could give me some perspective on
Sure.
wolf in sheep's clothing.
Sure.
And I found some of the criticisms to be valid, about how Saul Alinsky would always use like a conflict model where you pick an enemy that you would organize around.
Yep.
However, I found some of the criticisms to be kind of, I was weary of them, in that they made Saul Alinsky sound like a crypto-communist or part of the New Left during the 60s, when the church set aside with him because he was like an alternative to them. And another thing that I was weary about was like the guilt by association argument that they made, with Jacques Maritain being a friend and a supporter of Saul Alinsky, and it was some of these things that caused me a little concern. So I was just wondering if you had any perspective on that.
I would say this because, if, for those who didn't realize it, Father Ted is referring to a documentary that EWTN has been airing, and I'm in it because back in 69, 70, I was doing Alinsky-style community organizing. And Father, I would say this, from very personal knowledge, Alinsky had designated one of his lieutenants to approach Catholics to enlist them in the community organizing. That was for sure. And I was part of that. I mean, I was at those meetings where that gentleman who actually liked me, he'd argue with some of the other folks, but he sort of treated me the way John Wayne treats the kid in movie and stuff. And so I watched this going on, and it was clear that they were saying, we want to do things that are going to change society. So that was very explicitly trying to get various Catholics involved. Some of the things in terms of the call to action and some of the other involvement of the church in other places, I was not involved in. I didn't do that research, so I can't comment on that. I just don't know much about those other things. And I must also say, I never had before heard any link with Jacques Maritain. Jacques Maritain is someone I have great respect for as a philosopher. And I don't know any more specifics about it than that. There was no mention of him when I was involved in community organizing. That just wasn't part of it. I think that was material that the researchers who did this documentary had found letters between Maritain and Alinsky. And I don't know all that Maritain had understood of what Alinsky was up to. I just am not sure. So I can't comment more than that. But that Alinsky did assign one of his lieutenants to organize priests, to become organizers, absolutely, that I knew. In fact, the year after I had finished doing community, because I had to leave Chicago due to having witnessed a murder, they had a big workshop on organizing. So that was going on too. But that's as much as I know about more than that. But I also know I'm out of time. May the Lord bless you and keep you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And we can bring you this show and other shows only because you keep us in between your gas bill, your electric bill, and your cable bill. So please do so. We appreciate it, and God bless.